Batman Arkham Knight has stood since 2015 as the only Arkham game I never played. I've played Arkham City, Asylum and Origins, probably in that scuffed order, and yet for some reason I never dared the series' ultimate chapter. I mean, I vaguely remember firing it up once a long time ago, only to quit about 20 minutes in for some reason. I think I got confused at something really simple, and if I'm being entirely honest with you now, I wasn't planning on playing through it at this time, and was actually planning on doing a video on Arkham Origins, only to discover the PC performance can only be described as constipation mixed with diarrhea. So instead I picked up Batman Arkham Knight for £3 on a Steam sale, and turned my eye to that. The Batman Arkham game I never played. Will I like it, or will I hate it? Will it adequately carry my fantasy of being a billionaire by day and crime-fighting nutcase by night? Or will the game find a way to deny me that to satisfy an infuriating gimmick? As you can probably tell, all of this audio was recorded in hindsight. You see, I seem to recall Arkham Knight not being the most smoothly received back when it launched in 2015, which was 9 years ago now. And while that may very well be something from my imagination, or indeed nothing too major as to become a point 9 years down the line, it would seem there is at least a sentiment of preference for Arkham City among many of the Arkham series' devoted fans. And having also recently played through that game before playing this one, I can certainly see why that might be the case. Batman Arkham City was a masterclass of melded comic book caricature and cinematic grit. It has an atmospheric, tightly packed world, complete with storytelling and gameplay that seldom stray from the game's strengths. The game didn't lack for areas where it could have in theory improved, but it expertly delivered on its promise of providing that Batman fantasy, and as a result the bar was set very high indeed. As for Arkham Origins that released in 2013, being developed by Warner Bros. Games Montreal as opposed to Rocksteady, it wasn't necessarily bad and in many ways rivaled Arkham City in competence, but felt more like a sidestep than anything. So, if you played Arkham City first, any novelty value that Arkham Origins might have boasted ran the risk of going amiss. Not to mention a truly refined, calculating Batman experience would have been besides the point for the narrative direction that was chosen. And so going into Arkham Knight, City was the standard for Batman open world games. And for the best possible outcome, recapturing that high wasn't enough. You have to succeed it, and that is typically accomplished by expanding, delivering something that's more versatile, perhaps even more challenging. For instance, the semi-linear world of Arkham Asylum, with emphasis on backtracking, evolving into a full-blown open world in City, could be argued to be such an example of expansion, and a big talking point for arguing preference between one game and the other. So how did Arkham Knight thrust the Arkham series forwards? We get to drive the f***ing Batmobile. This new branch of mechanics was quite heavily featured in marketing material, and sure enough it did provide an entire new layer of gameplay to the Arkham series. And yes, it does slap a huge stupid grin on your inner 6-year-old's face as you tear up the streets of Gotham in what I'd call an over-engineered tank, but it also presented some new challenges for Arkham Knight to overcome. Not only did the world now need to be adapted for you to be operating this monstrosity of a machine around town, meaning much wider roads and no pedestrians so you don't feel tempted to try and run them over. Not that Arkham games prior have lacked for convenient excuses to keep pedestrians off the streets, but it also meant pacing had to be adjusted to suit that kind of gameplay. That gameplay had to be regularly justified in order to justify implementing it in the first place. That then had to be made flush with the less vehicular layers of gameplay, and they had to find a way to make it not boring. Now, when I previously referred to a potentially infuriating gimmick, the Batmobile is kind of what I had in mind, because this is where I feel the bulk of Batman Arkham Knight's problems stem from. I'll make no secret of the fact that at first it's certainly awe-inspiring, and of course I'll never turn down an opportunity to destroy every car in the Wayne Tower car park. There's your bonus, Mr. Fox. But as my playthrough dragged on, it did become very draining, and a criticism I've seen often brought up by others is that the Batmobile is practically shoehorned into far too much of the game. Unfortunately, I'm inclined to agree. But before we get carried away with where it went wrong, I'd like to say for the most part there's nothing inherently wrong with how the Batmobile plays. It's fairly fluid and seamless between other gameplay and of course quite manoeuvrable in battle mode. And that's a bloody good job because, as you've already gathered, you're going to be spending an awful lot of time in it. It's a fairly straightforward thing and it never feels too cumbersome to operate, split into two modes, driving mode and combat mode, in which it converts to a tank that can basically rotate on its own axis, which is useful when you're stacking up against an insurmountable force of enemy tanks, because superhero games do tend to have a fetish for paramilitaries. Not only is it for the most part easy to operate, but there are also nuances to attempt to keep things fresh. For instance, battle mode may not necessarily always be used for battle, and should you happen to be engaging in a high-speed pursuit, you're not necessarily cut off from firing missiles at your adversary. Simply put, as far as basic operation is concerned, the Batmobile is far less frustrating than it has any right to be, and there are plenty of games out there that do far worse in the vehicle department, and so the carring concept isn't necessarily the grievance at hand. However, its implementation at times does take the piss, even going as far as disrupting the gameplay loop the previous Arkham games thrived on. For instance, boss fights are no longer a remarkable event, and in their place we get driving around as quietly as possible, sneakily attacking tanks over and over again. It's not unchallenging, but it's not exactly engaging either, and because it takes such a long time to wear down any supporting tanks that you also have to sneak up on, the Cloudburst tank boss fight, for instance, takes ages to complete and really breaks down the pacing. I do understand why the game has such a fixation on stealth tank battles. After all, it is an extension of the Predator gameplay that is just so much fun in the Arkham games, but I still found it to be god-awful, especially since it was replacing a lot of your more traditional boss fights. I don't mind being put at a disadvantage and being forced to use stealth in a boss battle. In fact, Arkham City's Mr. Freeze fight is a great example of where that works incredibly well, especially for this series. But at best, compared to that, stealth segments in the Batmobile are just boring. And if it only happened the once, I'd forgive it and probably wouldn't have even brought it up. But there are several instances in which you're effectively forced to do the same thing. The boss fights of previous games, whether they be open conflict or in Predator mode, were one-offs, and they all varied somehow, even going as far as, in the case of, say, Mr. Freeze again, being incredibly unique. They became a culmination of the gameplay loop that energized you to continue it, because you know that no matter how much you experience the same old stuff, there will always be something different coming. Being forced to do the same thing time and time again is not a culmination. It just becomes an uninspired part of that loop. And the biggest challenge is staying interested long enough to get back to the good stuff. Because by the second time you're faced with the same thing in virtually the same environment, there's nothing to figure out. And that recurring tedium cheapens Arkham Knight immeasurably. Not to mention sours one's perspective when it comes to the better Batmobile gameplay, such as using it as an extension to your puzzle solving, or indeed being chased around a massive tunnel network by a giant excavator, or as simply another gadget at your disposal, using it as a remotely controlled tool to clear out a room full of armed guards in no time flat. It's hard to appreciate the Batmobile at all when, instead of playing to its strengths, the game deploys it to obstruct the experience. So oftentimes I found myself ejecting straight out of the Batmobile the moment it no longer became necessary, which is a shame when beneath all the bloating of its usage, there's a genuinely good layer of mechanics at play. It is true control mapping is a tad unorthodox, but beyond that it's rather fundamentally robust. And despite quickly devolving to being about as fun as a bowel screening, it did necessitate some positives that Arkham Knight delivered. For instance, the bigger world map, though not inherently a positive for a game in which you can either soar across the rooftops, or drive in a car below, or do anything in between. There's certainly some value to be had in having a sizable world space to exercise that particular fantasy. Of course, driving a car around requires more than 4 to 6 blocks to explore, and though I'd hardly describe Arkham Knight's Gotham, or at least the districts of Gotham we can explore, as big, it's a respectable size, and that gives us plenty to appreciate when you realise that visually Arkham Knight holds up rather incredibly. There's plenty to gaze at in this neon-dominated urban landscape, and the weather effects make for quite the aesthetically pleasing, atmospheric experience. There's plenty of content to get stuck into, though we'll get into that a bit later, and there are plenty of conversations to overhear from thugs in the distance, either discussing relevant topics giving us an insight into their intelligence, or in typical Arkham fashion, nonsensical bollocks. But now and again it gets used as a delivery mechanism for jokes.
Maybe it's the government. Behind Batman? No way. Think about it. Who's got that much money? Bruce Wayne? Yeah. Maybe it's him.
I don't know how to break this to you, gentlemen. Arkham Knight's world space is seeping with detail and atmosphere, and I can't mark it down for that. However, I'm not too fond of the idea that the entire portions of the city that we can go to have been evacuated, meaning everyone you encounter can more than likely be kicked swiftly in the head. And there's no reason to feel guilty for running anybody over in the car either. Going on, this was exactly what I've expected. Every Arkham game with an open world, be it Arkham City or Arkham Origins, had a convenient excuse to keep civilians out of harm's way. Arkham City has the strongest reasoning, being set in a literal prison of sorts, albeit not the kind of prison anyone with half a brain would come up with. Origins had a flimsier excuse with a lockdown in place of some description, and in Night all we get is an opening scene that does display there is usually life in Gotham, but because Scarecrow's active with his fear toxin, the city's been evacuated. I get the reasoning behind it from a technical perspective, but it doesn't make it any less absurd. Leaving us with the bare bones of essential personnel and enemy factions does convert Gotham into a playground where we shouldn't feel too bad for causing destruction, but it does compromise stakes a bit. If only the villains are left, instead of entertaining them, why don't we just leave as well? I know that's a dumb argument, but because the bulk of the population that Batman is there to protect are gone, the narrative stakes are compromised, and the atmosphere at street level at least is stunted. Instead of experiencing a night in Gotham at rest, the streets are populated by the chaos of rioting hooligans, and though the reasoning behind such a choice is fair enough, criminals tearing up the streets is never quite as interesting a reason to stay off street level as much as possible unless in the Batmobile than having a lived-in environment full of neutral parties, simply going about their evening business. But, like I said, the reasoning is fair enough. The Batmobile is a literal tank, so unless something is as fixed as, say, a building, chances are good we can go through it, and it would be dissonant to have free access to a device capable of wanton destruction in denser city streets. But I'd also argue there's a disconnect in running over thugs at muck fuck and leaving them unconscious in cars that are on fire. I mean, I know we're supposed to believe he's going to be okay, but things just aren't looking good for Bro right now. Of course, in the end it just boils down to what Arkham Knight was able to facilitate, and although I did want to make a point of it, it isn't necessarily reasonable to hold that against the game. To avoid Blitz attacking your ears with further rants about the Batmobile, I'd like to talk a bit about how the rest of the game plays. And to simplify things, if you liked Arkham City's gameplay, Arkham Knight doesn't go too far wrong in this department either, as much of the positives of previous titles do carry over. It's no surprise that belonging to a series with such enjoyable gameplay to begin with, Arkham Knight didn't attempt to radically reinvent the wheel. And so you can see the evolution of particular mechanics from Arkham Asylum at the start of the series to Arkham Knight, which is the end. The combat and stealth still relied on the same principles, all that changed was there was more possibilities, and these variables help keep the systems fresh. Complexity, however, can be a double-edged sword. When so much is going on in such a fast-paced environment, it can be tricky to keep up mentally, and in the Arkham game's case, the combat system does give you as much an advantage as you could ask for in this respect. It's fluid and responsive, and if you cock up, you know it's down to player error and not the game registering your input. However, having so many tools at your disposal means it's likely you'll want to experiment, and that's where things start to break down. Arkham City's combat had enough visual distinction and combat variables for you to go on a stimulating, unholy rampage, and the amount of tools with combat capacity felt fitting. And Arkham Knight has a touch more at play. There are more variety to attacks from enemy archetypes, and there's some element of fluidity in which said archetype can alter themselves somewhat, changing what attacks they perform and what attacks actually work on them for a short while. There are more instances where the scenario dictates you use particular tools or particular moves, and there are more obstacles among the rabble of thugs that can break down your flow and disrupt your combo. If you're good at the game, and I wouldn't argue that I am, you can still reach dizzying heights in that regard, but the game asks more of you, which is fantastic. The surplus of information the game feeds you, however, can at times be a tad overwhelming. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I'd argue not. Arkham Knight is advocating for avoiding button mashing, but there are moments where one move simply does not flow into the next, and for no reason at all at times, your combo just bails. Though I'm not sure if that's entirely on the game or if I'm just a bit heavy with my thumbs, so you'll have to let me know if you've had a similar experience in the comments where, even though you've attempted to perform an action that should be perfectly fine, Batman refuses and the combo stops, or the combo just disappears. If this is down to some player error, and I'm 99% confident that it is, it's a good example of how the Arkham game combat is intended to function. You see, you can button mash your way through a combat experience fairly easily, and you can indeed simply spam the same ability over and over again, and chances are good, provided you don't get hit too much, you will make it out the other side. But for the satisfaction of truly feeling like Batman, you need to put a bit more effort in and be more deliberate with your input. And the fact that the combo meter can at times seem a bit punishing is just a teaser of how deep the combat system can actually be when you dedicate time to learning it properly. And you can look up videos on YouTube of people who appear to have mastered it, and honestly it's quite mesmerising to look at. I apologise that chances are slim you'll see such feats here. Arkham Knight does bring new elements to the combat table, for instance the idea of regularly engaging in fights with an ally in which at any time you can switch between playing as Batman and whoever Batman is fighting alongside, be it Nightwing, Robin, Catwoman. If there's anyone else, I've certainly forgotten. And above all else, this dynamic provides more variety, if not depth, and brings impact to various fight sequences that are attached to storytelling. Away from that, your enemies' dropped weapons, if they glow blue, on the floor means they can be picked up. That, if nothing else, satisfies refreshing the visual aspect of the gameplay, which has its value. It's also really fun to clatter people with a baseball bat. It gives a feeling of that adaptability you'd expect a master hand-to-hand combatant like the Dark Knight to possess. Not to mention, it's good to see that instead of simply being utilised by Batman encounters, you can use what winds up in your hand for a tad longer, though eventually you will drop it. So if at all you find it to make your life easier, it will only do so for a short bit, and therefore won't imbalance the fight. Now, another thing that I've really come to appreciate about Arkham Knight's iteration of the Arkham combat system are the environmental takedowns. These come in the form of assisted takedowns if the Batmobile happens to be close by, or if you happen to be fighting in an environment influenced by a tech-savvy ally. Or indeed, my personal favourite, there are just bits of clutter that happen to be in the combat zone, and should your enemy venture too close to one, you can use parts of the environment around you to take them out. I like that emphasis on being mindful of your surroundings. I do, however, find these to at times be a tad awkward to activate and can often compromise your streak. I sometimes find transitioning out of these animations to be a tad awkward too. Nonetheless, they're very satisfying. Just like the use of makeshift weapons that just so happen to be laying around, it gives that sense of adaptability that you'd expect of Batman, meaning it serves the fantasy the game is out to provide, and I really appreciate that. The free flow of combat is an area where the Arkham games improved entry after entry. However, Arkham Knight does go backward in one respect, and I mentioned it in my tank rant that I couldn't wait to get out the way. Boss fights. Beyond the obvious Batmobile bias in this department, your bog standard combat boss fights aren't entirely absent, though I reckon you'd be forgiven for forgetting about them. I suppose Big Man as seen here qualifies. After all, he is given a health bar, however he doesn't necessarily attack in waves, but rather as part of a wave of bog standard enemies, and you wail on him just like you would your average thug. There's no trick to it, and there's no exercising your mind like you would in some boss fights in Arkham City, for instance. You just engage in what isn't far removed from average combat, and that's kind of it. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't even notice the health bar. It certainly took me a while to twig onto it. Beyond that, it becomes tricky as to what you could conventionally define as a combat boss fight. I suppose the pig fight certainly stands out, but he's not exactly a boss, he's just the culmination of a glorified brawl at the heart of a rather uniquely constructed event. And though it has value as a standout piece of side content, it doesn't necessarily have boss fight gravitas. You're just fighting his mindless human monstrosities while he occasionally lobs knives at you. And progression through that piece of content is exclusive to taking out his rather unthreatening goons. To clarify, I'm not taking issue with the quality of this moment as such as part of my point, but rather simply to state that boss fights tend to go amiss in Arkham Knight, at least in the traditional sense. There are 3 Arkham Knight boss segments technically, but they occur as part of other branches of gameplay. 2 in the Batmobile, and 1 that conforms quite tightly to the Predator segment. And that latter one isn't common either, but we'll discuss that when we come to the stealth. But look, the fact that most of what could be classified as technically a boss fight occurs as part of the Batmobile segments isn't necessarily the fault of the Batmobile segments. It doesn't reflect spectacularly as a bias, but this content being present doesn't automatically subtract it from the other layers of gameplay. The fact that it feels too light in those other layers is squarely because it's too light in those other layers. But it is rather funny that the Riddler gets an actual in-person battle, should you dare to collect, I'm sorry, how many trophies? But Deathstroke gets a generic Cobra Tank cat and mouse, followed by getting flattened instantly in a cutscene. With all due respect, Rocksteady. What? Now, with the combat adequately covered, let's move on to the Predator mode, which is the Arkham series' fancy word for stealth. Just like the series combat, Arkham Knight serves us the ultimate mechanical version of the stealth, in a more generally speaking sense, meaning there are more opportunities, there are more gadgets to aid us, and moreover there are more challenges. Fear takedowns are a nice introduction that effectively serves as a bridge between stealth and combat, allowing you to go loud in style to quickly take out a series of foes. This new implementation requires you to complete stealth takedowns and, for the most part, replaces double takedowns, which I suppose is a negative and a positive. The Fear multi-takedowns are more visually impressive by some margin, however, they're not as convenient, and do require you to gather a few enemies in close proximity to be effective, and they adhere to their own laws of viability, so why one replaces the other is quite unclear. However, when applied properly, the Fear multi-takedown will allow Batman to take out up to 6 people in quick succession, so when applied properly, this newer implementation was much more effective. As for other aspects to stealth, what I quite liked was enemies grew wise to your tactics. If they see you using particular hiding spots, they may compromise those spots. They may destroy grates so you can't use them as access points to the ventilation shafts, and they may stick sensors to gargoyles to prevent you from using those, because if you do, it'll basically make a noise and they'll know you're there. It's nothing outstanding, but it's the game encouraging you to not rely on the same tactic over and over again just to clear an entire room, though there are plenty of instances where that works.
I ain't ever seen so much cash. You should have let
So, yeah, they could never know where I was. Outside of some circumstances though, the concept does usually tend to work. Moving off of that point, I do like that the stealth in Arkham Knight dares you to be bolder. And the way this is handled is by deploying an enemy archetype that occurs exclusively in these stealth segments. For instance, this big bloke with a minigun. If he sees you, he'll annihilate you in no time flat, but he cannot be taken down in stealth. You either have to face him head on, or use an environment takedown of some description, for instance detonating explosive gel on a weak wall when he's nearby. And the game isn't afraid of deploying more than one of these at a time, and they usually come as part of a broader wave of regular thugs, not only reinforcing the methodical aspect of the stealth that makes it so engaging in the first place, but also requiring you to know when to break cover, or indeed risking exposing yourself by setting up traps. I mean, at first the minigun thugs seem like somebody at Rocksteady's idea of a bad joke, but they are seldom deployed in environments without opportunities galore to get rid of them. and it gives you further incentive to use the actual stealth rather than trying to cheese combat, because these guys can do some serious damage. Not that that necessarily makes them difficult to deal with if you use your brain. There are also enemies who can disrupt your detective vision, meaning you can't really use it to either map out how many you have left to take down, how many are armed or anything, and they'll need to be taken on before you can really survey the area you're doing stealth in. And there are also archetypes that can track you if you use detective mode, meaning in some scenarios you need to avoid using that as much as possible, which is tricky enough because it's such a seductive habit when you're in stealth, and as annoying as it can be, that can make things interesting. And beyond that, there are also medics who can apparently wake up those you've knocked out, though I was going to say I could count on one hand how many times they did that in my playthrough, but they didn't at all. Beyond that, you have sentry guns that you can take out so that they don't shoot you to bits, or indeed you can hack them one at a time to pass them silently, though sometimes they're just in a big cluster together, and that is a new dynamic to contend with against previous Arkham games, which can be fun, but it can also be quite infuriating. That said, I do like how the Arkham series tends to attempt to get you on your toes when using stealth, and I typically found the implementations here to be welcome, because as a result of these, in a lot of scenarios you have to rely on more than just one or two tactics. Like many of the additions to combat, the additions here are the evolution of a system that wasn't broken and therefore wasn't unnecessarily fixed, only expanded, and that gives Arkham Knight a bit of an advantage when it comes to adding complexity. Chances are good by the time you get round to playing this game, the fundamental systems aren't alien to you, and while the game eases you in before it throws anything deemed too crazy at you, though I'd argue it isn't terribly crazy anyway, there's never a situation that I feel is dumbed down. Though in a lot of scenarios, if you really are crafty, there are ways and means where you can dumb it down for yourself, but the only person you're cheating is yourself. Though understandably, there are environments and situations where such an approach is appealing. There is, however, a lot to experiment with, so if you're after the satisfaction of being Batman, that does naturally extend to stealth as it has done in previous titles, and Arkham Knight does in many ways strive to bring that satisfaction to new heights. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows here, as there's still the boss argument to contend with in Predator mode. Now, there's one memorable Predator boss segment that I can think of, and that is of course with the Arkham Knight, following a face-off with him in a drill tank, which is probably one of the better tank segments too, mainly because we get to watch the Batmobile get obliterated into a million pieces, as at this point it had caused no shortage of heartache. Jokes aside, I did actually like that bit. Now, this Predator fight is memorable because it's the only main villain face-off of its like, but it's fairly straightforward. Just get under the gargoyles the Arkham Knight is on, enjoy a cutscene of narrative significance, and stealthily clear out a room full of armed thugs in the meantime. Provided the Arkham Knight doesn't see you, which is much easier than it sounds, the latter is more what you're actually doing. So it's not really what I'd consider an actual boss. That said, there is a health bar, so it's trying to be, but when the greatest threat posed is by the auxiliaries that just happen to be present, then it just becomes a bog-standard Predator segment, albeit with narrative significance. And it wasn't even the most challenging stealth section the game has to throw at you. That just existed, and the final confrontation with the Arkham Knight, though it made sense to be delivered the way it was a little underwhelming. Another thing I suppose qualifies is Johnny Charisma singing while you, playing as Robin, disarm loads of bombs, and Batman rather idly hallucinates that it's the Joker. There's nothing actually directly wrong with this set piece, but the fact that it's the next best thing is a bit sad. Because the point I'm making isn't that the confrontations that are present are necessarily bad, it's just that they aren't really boss fights most of the time, and when they are, they don't feel anywhere near as inspired as Arkham games of the past. Take Two-Face for instance, we just stealth clatter him like he's a normal thug. They could have formulated a more interesting scenario there, but they didn't. Moments that pose a unique challenge in Arkham Knight are rare, and when you think they've accomplished that in stealthy tank battles, all that winds up being challenged is your patience. When you manoeuvre around a tank constantly swiveling its field of view 360 degrees, praying that your missiles will lock on in time. I understand that they shifted a lot of the boss-related tomfoolery to the Batmobile to showcase the new dynamic that Knight boasted, but when that leaves a lot to be desired, you can see why it would be deflating. The absence of these unique encounters in other forms of gameplay as a result is felt, and while such statements observing that are harsh on what's actually there, it's because a big spotlight is being shone on what isn't. Is it the end of the world for the game's quality because it simply lacks in the boss department? Well, no. Obviously not, it's a game that I thought had a lot to like. Now, I do think the standard for boss fights was set quite high by Batman Arkham Origins, a game not even made by the same people, but it certainly would have helped to see more of them in more varied ways here, because the game provided so many opportunities for creativity there with advancements made in both combat and stealth that would have been more interesting to explore in more one-on-one scenarios, not that I can speak to the quality of something that doesn't exist. However, to round things off and give Arkham Knight the benefit of the doubt, the gameplay overall can best be summed up as an Arkham game. You can't really go far wrong with that. There's certainly something to be said about perhaps having an overcrowded tool belt, but I guess you could just not use what doesn't work for you. Gliding around Gotham as Batman is never not fun, and the aesthetic value of the world makes it a pleasure to enjoy, and the combat and stealth continued to hold their own. Narrative-wise, Arkham Knight is what I'd refer to as probably okay. Your main villain's a scarecrow who's nowhere near as interesting as he was in Arkham Asylum, and the mysterious Arkham Knight who at first seems interesting. After all, what's not to like about a character who clearly knows so much about Batman and we don't have the first clue who he is, only for that mystery to be given away in flashbacks long before the reveal is actually made, rendering the impact of such a moment completely impotent because by the time we get there it's painfully obvious. Emphasis like that is known to make or break storytelling, and sadly we're dealing with work derivative of other work here because that's just the nature of comic book storylines in general. So when Arkham Knight randomly decides to put emphasis on a flashback of something that didn't happen in any of the previous Arkham games, and we're dealing with a nameless, faceless villain who appears to know Batman, the correlation is just a tad too obvious. Fortunately, Batman isn't just battling that, but also his subconscious, I guess. Throughout more or less the entire story, Batman regularly hallucinates the Joker. Despite the Joker having died in Arkham City, we still therefore get to enjoy Mark Hamill's portrayal. It would have been nice to see the Arkham games move past having the Joker present, but you know what, for this story it actually works. Does it get annoying at times to constantly have the clown talking at you because, well, Kevin Conroy's Batman doesn't really respond? Sure. Not that it would make too much sense for a man of few words to talk to a hallucination.
Lucius, you're not gonna believe this. There's a clown in the corner of the room.
But the premise behind this as a subplot makes perfect sense, I guess, and if anything came full circle to enrich the narrative. But there are moments in the story where you can't seem to go 5 yards without hallucinating Joker, who runs a comprehensive commentary on more or less everything. Whether that's too much and actively obstructs the experience is certainly something for debate, because the game in which he's most prominent begins with us cremating him. Finally, interactive incineration of corpses in my AAA video game. I don't really intend to go into an in-depth narrative critique as such. Batman Arkham Knight's story from my point of view is okay. It's nothing that popped out at me and made me go wow, but they definitely had some cool ideas, and being the last of the Arkham games, in this main part of the series at least, it wasn't unsatisfying to me, if that makes sense. It feels like a definite end to the story as opposed to a perpetual middle part that many another franchise has elected to stay in to avoid having to end the series and therefore end the cash flow. It takes a lot of respectable quality to end a franchise so popular, or at least the main run of titles in such a franchise, and so despite the fact the plot can at times be a bit lumpy and bumpy, Arkham Knight certainly didn't suffer from stalling for the next entry to the series. The biggest issue it actually suffers from is betraying its own plot twists, meaning you can see what happens next coming a mile away, although that's not entirely unique for superhero narratives. But there is one sort of glaring issue with how the story ends, but because it was the last one I'll give it a pass, but it's worth mentioning. It's also a great segue into talking about the side content, and then I can finally sleep. And that's that in order to see the full ending, you need to acquire 100% completion. Considering Arkham Knight is the last chronologically in the series, you can give it a pass for that. However, that doesn't in its own right make 100%ing this game appealing, especially when the quality and calibre of side content ranges so widely on my scale of preference. There are plenty of checklisty objectives that you have to do repetitively, for instance rescuing firefighters, destroying cars for some reason, taking out checkpoints and towers, which I don't 100% not understand the appeal of, but these are very Ubisoft objectives to be carrying out. Away from that, the fact the Riddler's even in Arkham Knight is either a testament to Batman's incompetence or a commentary on the fact that you probably didn't bother to collect all the trophies in the last game. I'm sorry, there's nothing on this planet that could compel me to collect 243 vapid question mark trophies dotted across the map. The trophies aren't individually bad to collect, don't get me wrong. They have puzzles surrounding them that require you to use your head a bit, so they're not meaningless content, but 243 is excessive, especially since these trophies aren't used to gatekeep his main challenges. So you can do all of those, build up to the boss fight, and then he simply comes out with this.
Enough! This is beneath me. You are beneath me. You want to finish this, detective? Then you must earn the privilege.
Solve every last riddle in this city and I'll fight you, Batman, but not a moment before.
I know the number of those trophies in Arkham City was quite ridiculous too, but at least that didn't gatekeep the ending. Credit where credit's due on Riddler though, his challenges, his main challenges anyway, are quite fun. I suppose the trophy collecting is okay to do as you go along, but I wouldn't go out of my way for it as such. There are other pieces of side content that are meh, but they don't necessarily feel tedious to do because they're not as long. For instance, Firefly encounters are fairly straightforward. Find a fire station on fire, put the fire out, and then he comes back and the building's on fire again, but now we chase him down, jump out of the Batmobile, punch him in the head a few times, rinse, repeat. Now he's in jail. It's not a good bit of side content, but at least it's not tedious. I suppose the Azrael stuff's got an interesting story to it, but you just play as Azrael while he partakes in a few simulated brawls and avoids getting hit, or it'll reset. It does lean into some of the better gameplay that the Arkham series has to offer, and there is a bit of further curiosity to it, but it's nothing special again. However, I did really kind of enjoy doing it, and you actually get to make a decision in that, to either fail to kill Batman or to break the sword, and have Azrael turn out to not be a total dickhead, I guess. And then there's helping Nightwing locate and destroy some of Penguin's weapon stashes by chasing a van through the streets of Gotham for a wee bit, teaming up to fight a group of goons and blowing up a vault that the weapons just conveniently happen to be in. There are some one-off missions on there as well, for instance Lamb to the Slaughter, where we contend with a sacrificial cult, or we catch up with Hush, who, if you remember from Arkham City, has stolen Bruce's face. So Batman drops a Bruce bomb of his own and slaps the guy through a perfectly good desk, and all we have to do is press one button.
My face!
Away from that, we get to stop Two-Face from robbing a few banks. We get to contend with a literal man-bat, which has an interesting short story to it, not to mention it jump scares us into existence, so it has that touch of fright advantage. And we can investigate some serial murders that highlights how underutilized the detective aspect of this game actually is. And that leads us to a fellow named Pig, whose unsettling mask is only the tip of the iceberg for how depraved he is. Let's just say he's the kind of maniac you'd want on board on karaoke night. But yeah, this is perhaps one of the most interesting bits of side content that Arkham Knight has to offer. I do like this level of atmosphere in a Batman game. This certainly felt unique. Fending off his effectively zombified victims while he lobs knives at you and sings opera music is definitely the over-the-top grit that I quite like in Arkham games. So overall, the side content in Arkham Knight is a fine assortment of varied bits and bats, only made a bit more tedious through the fact that the true ending to the game is locked behind 100% completion. Like I said, being the final game in the series, I'm going to be lenient with that and say it's not a huge deal. And there is of course a version of the ending you can watch if you only do so much of the side content, which softens the blow and gives you an idea of what the ending is supposed to be, so you can happily retreat to look up the full thing online, I suppose. There are some extra bits of side content added in by DLC, but I'll probably save discussing the DLC for a separate video, as there's a fair bit of it, or at least it's broken down into various compartments, so it would be more interesting in that format, I believe. So let me know if you'd be interested in that. Overall, I don't really believe Arkham Knight has the strongest lineup of side content, but it does have some standouts. For instance, Pig, the Man-Bat, and they're not necessarily anything super special, but they were more the type of stuff that I'd like to see in a game like this as side content. I'll take thought-provoking and storytelling-focused side missions over checklist objectives any day of the week. Before I come to a conclusion, auxiliary positives: Arkham Knight has a good soundtrack. I like it. Customization-wise, there are some cool skins for the Batsuit, and of course the Batmobile. And of course, as one final point before I've officially run out of things to say, the game had a photo mode. I like that. I mean, these days it's a rather homogenised thing, but back in 2015 it wasn't really as common. I'm sure plenty of games did sport it, and the fact that lots definitely do these days doesn't cheapen the fact that a game can have photo mode, because it's a great way for me to gather thumbnail-worthy screenshots. So, I'm going to say this outright, I do like Batman Arkham Knight. I think it's a good game. I don't think it's anywhere near as tight as Arkham City, Asylum, and in some respects Origins, and it certainly suffers for how the Batmobile, for instance, is implemented, if not the fact that it is in the first place. The storytelling isn't the most riveting I've ever seen or heard, it's also not the most unriveting, and the gameplay holds up fairly reasonably because, well, it's an Arkham game. Advancements made to the combat and stealth feel for the most part welcome, and for a 9-year-old game, visually it doesn't look half bad either. In my view, it really doesn't surpass Arkham City for me, because I just find Arkham Knight does shoot itself in the foot a tad too often. But overall, for a game I recall being quite maligned on its release, I was pleasantly surprised to find that it wasn't dismal by any stretch. Because the truth is, this game has a lot going for it, and it doesn't leave that potential always undelivered. There are, in my mind, problem areas where the game is blatantly flawed, but it really wasn't a bad send-off for the Arkham saga, even if some of the loose ends it ties up does feel a tad rushed. And then of course, how can you not love Kevin Conroy as Batman? May he rest in peace. Ultimately, I'm really glad I finally got around to playing Arkham Knight fully, and I'm glad I only spent £3 getting a PC version for it, because for that low sum I haven't even got an inkling of regret. And with that, I'm going to leave today's video there. I'd like to thank you all for suffering my yapping for 40 odd minutes at this point. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff. Only of course if you want to. And if you did like this video, maybe check out my previous one on Batman Arkham City. If you do still use some form of social media, maybe bang me a follow over there, but at this point I don't think I'd blame you if you didn't. After all, social media platforms can be a tad like purgatory. Be sure to flock to the comments and let me know if you'd like to see me do a video where I cover this game's many DLCs. But with that now sorted, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please take care and goodbye.